Thank you for joining NWSOFA. Please be aware this call is being recorded and will very likely show up on Facebook and...
Greetings, everybody. This is Mark Lundholm. I'm the climate change lead for NWSOFA-Indivisible, and this is our first monthly meeting of the year, of the new year, 2021. Climate change is morphing into seemingly all things environmental, but there certainly are connections here. I worked in the environmental field on the business side of things, mostly doing oversight, and was only involved in one railroad derailment project it was opposite Philadelphia, which involved some tank cars leaking vinyl chloride, which was new to me. But anyway, if you ever worked in the environmental business, to work on these things, you needed a OSHA 40-hour hazardous materials training and an annual 8-hour refresher to keep you at least somewhat abreast of what's being transported out there. They did not let you on emergency response sites if you didn't have this training. And for that reason, and a question I have with the railroad people is, do they ever get any safety training like this? And people in the transportation business should all get that kind of training. And our first responders, our police and fire people also should be trained in hazardous material stuff, because this kind of stuff is being transported all over the place all the time. And you should know what danger you're in if you have to respond to it or if you get near it. So that being said, we're offering this program with Jerry Songer's presentation with several railroad connected people. And they're talking about the problems with transporting some of these materials and what problems they've caused and why there is a real need for education and training in this area. And so let me just pause a minute. I'm going to have Bill Davis talk about NWSOFA, and then we will turn it over to Jerry Songer to start the presentation. So Bill and Sarah.
Great. Thank you. My name is Bill Davis. I am the NWSOFA chapter co-lead, and Sarah Horan is here today. She is the other co-lead of our chapter. NWSOFA stands for Northwest Suburbs, and that's where we're coming from the Chicago suburbs. And we were a Organizing for Action group, and we are now an Indivisible group. We have over 5,000 members in 6 townships in the land beyond O'Hare. We work tirelessly on 9 different issues. One of them we'll be presenting tonight that Mark heads up is climate and environmental change. But other groups are like our Stand With Women group on women's issues, the ERA, etc. We have financial and economic group. We have our Restore Our Democracy group that works on, this week they'll be giving a presentation on the census and the importance of redistricting across the country. We have our diversity groups. We have our social justice group. We have our healthcare teams. And we have engaged in the last couple of years increasingly into supporting candidates that support our issue teams. So one of the big groups that I missed was our gun violence prevention group, who is our longest standing group. Our goal is to inform and educate our membership, and not only our membership, but as far as our reach can take us. And today, with the virtual nature of these presentations, the reach goes pretty far, and we gain increasingly newer members that are outside of our immediate areas. So, Jerry, we thank you and your assembled team. I understand that they're from Canada, the U.S., different parts in the U.S. It is always amazing, and we can't be happier to have you folks here on this presentation tonight. Mark, back to you.
Okay, so I first saw maybe an earlier version of this presentation, maybe, what was it, maybe a year and a half ago, Jerry? And I've become increasingly aware of, explosive oil being transported by rail, and now they're talking about compressed liquid natural gas being transported by rail, and robot engineered trains. And I have a problem with all of that. So your presentation is going to address this. And so with that being said, Jerry, would you please introduce yourself and take it away?
Thank you so much. And again, I want to thank our speakers tonight. We have an international crowd here joining us, and I will introduce each of them to you. My name is Jerry Songer. I first became interested in this issue in May of 2014 when I realized, what was about 5 trains, maybe actually about 2 or 3 trains going past my house turned into over 20 a mile long. And I looked around thinking, this is not normal. So I started doing some research. And that's when I realized what these trains were carrying. And I became extremely, extremely concerned. Nobody in my community knew about it. The first incident that I started reading was that of Lac Mégantic in Quebec, Canada. And that's why I'm thrilled to have Bruce Campbell here, who was involved in making after that incident. I'm an educator. I'm the legislative director of the Northwest Suburban Teachers Union Local 1211. Because of my concern for this issue, it prompted me into getting involved in running for local government, and I may move up to state at some point. I'm thinking about it. Don't know. We'll see what happens down the road. But I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the legislation that I've been working on. So I want to introduce you first here to Bruce Campbell. He is a former executive director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, one of Canada's leading independent think tanks. He is author of The Lac Mégantic Rail Disaster, Public Betrayal, Justice Denied. Campbell also wrote 3 major reports and a number of media commentaries on the Lac Mégantic rail disaster, in which he chronicles the history of regulatory and managerial failure that made the Lac Mégantic wreck invisible and which drives increasingly risky industry that hasn't learned any of the lessons revealed there. For his work on Lac Mégantic, Bruce was awarded the Law Foundation of Ontario Community Leadership and Justice Fellowship and spent 2016 as a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. Throughout his career, Bruce has written numerous reports on economic policy, trade, and investment, Canada-US relations, and the political economy of oil. Previous books include edited volumes of Living with Uncle, Canada-US Relations in an Age of Empire and Medicare, Facts, Myths, Problems, and Promise. Bruce is an adjunct professor at York University, Faculty of Environmental Studies, and he is a senior fellow at Ryerson University Center for Free Expression. Bruce, as we had mentioned, lives in Ottawa, Canada. We're going to save questions for the end. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat as we go, and we'll try to maybe, Bill, if you wouldn't mind keeping an eye on them and maybe, throw some out there that you thought were relevant. We may answer some of those questions as we get into the presentation. So Bruce, thank you again for coming all the way from Canada, eh?
Hey.
Eh?
Wow, that was quite an introduction. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you for inviting me. This is this is interesting because I'm not the most astute proficient in technology, so I'm not sure how this is going to go. But let me first start by just saying how I became involved, just very briefly. I mean, I was on vacation on the East Coast when it happened. I just couldn't believe that it was happening in our country. It was just stunning, and so fortunately in the cottage we were staying, we had internet, so I kind of was glued to this to the internet watching this. And as I watched it, I noticed what I did notice as a policy analyst, that there was a real blame game going on. And I was thinking to myself, you know, I could write something about this. I was at the Canadian Centre for Policy. I could write a report that would kind of stand back, because this didn't make sense to me. When I got back from my vacation, I learned from my administrator that she had lost 3 people in the disaster. The 2 young girls, 4 and 9, and their mother. They were living in an apartment very close to the track. And so that kind of started for me. I just couldn't, I had to keep on going. I ended up writing 3 reports. And then, as Jerry said, I spent 2016 as a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa in the law faculty. And that's when the people in Lac-Mégantic were reading my stuff, reading my reports, but I had never made the direct contact. And in 2016, that happened. And they invited me to come. The Transport Committee was in town, so they invited me to come and join them during that session. And it just kind of went from there. And the people that I've been most in contact with since then have been the Citizens Coalition for Rail Safety. When I told Robert Bellefleur, who's the founder and main spokesperson, that I was doing this, he suggested, I asked him if he'd write something as some kind of a statement, and he provided me a statement, and I have it, and I'm going to read it. So I'm just going to read this message, and those are 3 of the members of the citizens group. And if you can see the screen, the fellow with the big beard came the closest to dying in the derailment and the disaster. He had been at the Musique Café, which was the club where most of the people died. He had decided to leave a bit early, and he was walking across the tracks, because the club is very close to the tracks. He was walking across the tracks, and he saw the train barreling towards him, and he just dove. He just dove out of the way, and it was really close. It was so close that the heat of the train passing by put the nylon fibers of his shirt deep into his skin. He still has problem with that, but just give you a sense of how close he came. Anyways, those are Robert is the founder and spokesperson, and he wrote the following statement. And I'll read it to you, okay? So the Coalition of Citizens and Organizations Committed to Rail Safety and their foundation salutes the members of the Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action and congratulates them for their commitments to preserve the environment and the safety of people living along rail lines in America. As you know, the citizens of Lac-Mégantic suffered enormously and are still struggling today to recover from the aftermath and consequences of the rail tragedy of July 13th, 2013, an avoidable disaster which unfortunately claimed 47 victims, destroyed the town center, and seriously contaminated the mouth of the lake, Lac-Mégantic Lake, and the Chaudière River, going up for more than 25 kilometers. So this is why we, the citizens of Lac-Mégantic, fully support the initiatives of your Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action group meeting today in Chicago. In our opinion, the lessons of Lac-Mégantic, as Bruce Campbell that's me, so aptly put it, we're not learned by the railway companies, and particularly not by our Canadian and American governments. The proof is that we are still helplessly witnessing an uninterrupted succession of derailments of oil convoys in the US and Canada every year since Lac-Mégantic. Our politicians and regulatory authorities still fail miserably to properly protect populations and their environment from disasters caused by derailments and the massive spills of oil and various contaminants in the environment of our cities, our rivers, our countrysides. Here in Lac-Mégantic, our group still has to regularly inspect the rails themselves running through Lac-Mégantic due to poor maintenance and the flagrant lack of serious rail inspections by the operator and by the Ministry of Transport. Imagine, it is again we, the citizens of Lac-Mégantic, who must regularly notify authorities of the defects in our railways. It's just nonsense after suffering Canada's worst rail disaster. In addition, almost 8 years have already passed in our newly constructed city center, and though promised, is still not protected by a rail bypass. In this context, while we support the Keystone XL pipeline decision, the population of Lac-Mégantic anticipates or worries that its abandonment will result in the resumption of massive oil transport by rail through Lac-Mégantic and elsewhere in North America. It is unacceptable at a time when we must urgently turn to renewable energy in order to save the planet from certain mass extinction. In Lac-Mégantic, after the oil tragedy, local authorities and Hydro-Quebec opted for the installation of 1,000 solar panels supplying an electric microgrid serving the new downtown of Lac-Mégantic. This microgrid currently provides more than half of the electrical energy consumed by the new community and commercial buildings in the new downtown area. In addition, the region also has a large wind farm. These green investments are our way of snubbing the oil that we always fear in Lac-Mégantic. It is also through the Lac-Mégantic region that the new electrical interconnection network will soon pass between Quebec and the states of Maine and Massachusetts, New England. Massachusetts. New England Clean Energy is expected to supply these North American states with clean, renewable energy from hydroelectric dams in northern Quebec very soon. This is the best way for we Canadians and probably for you Americans with your new President Biden to reduce the massive transport of oil by rail and pipeline in North America. It is really by significantly reducing our oil consumption that we will be able to secure the lives of our children and our planet. From now on, the use of renewable green energies becomes our only lifeline on this earth, which still tolerates us despite what we inflict upon it. Good luck, and good luck to all. Robert Bellefleur, spokesperson for the Coalition of Citizens and Organizations Committed to Rail Safety. So that's the statement. Now I am going to say a few words. I don't know. This is the title of the book I wrote. And how do you go back? So anyways, that's the book I wrote. I want to talk a little about these two fellows. One is named Bill Ackman on the left, and the other is Hunter Harrison. For the rail people, they are well familiar with Hunter Harrison. We are too. He took over from when CN Rail was privatized in the mid-90s. Very soon after, he became the CFO, and then soon after that became the CEO. He did that until 2009 when he retired. he was a pretty brutal guy. He and the unions could speak to their view of him, but he obviously made money for the company, and he had a reputation for being a real hard ass. Now, Bill Acton is the head of something called Pershing Square. It's an investment hedge fund based in New York. Now, Bill Acton didn't know much about rail, but he knew that the shares of CP were very undervalued, and he knew a lot about stock values. And we're talking about an era where finance capitalism has become dominant with the collapse of Bretton Woods, and then the growth of the financial sector and the dominance of financial sector. So what he did is he saw that CP had track in North Dakota. Bakken shale production was starting to boom. CP was there to reap the benefits, and so he got a controlling interest with relatively few shares, forced the board to resign, install his own people, and then hired Hunter Harrison. And so that was really that happened in 2011, 2012. By that time, it was the oil by rail boom was really underway. And this fellow, Ed Burkhardt, who actually lives in Chicago, I think in Kenilworth, was I won't go into his history, but he had a holding company called World, and in 2002, I think he bought a company that went from Montreal through Lac-Mégantic into Maine, and then upwards towards New Brunswick to the refinery of in St. John, New Brunswick. So he bought this company. Is actually at one point owned by CP, but they got rid of it. He bought it, and he was sort of like Hunter Harrison, except a much smaller scale. He was cutting corners at all costs, which he did. He had a rough time in the early years because the resource industry had fallen apart. But once the oil started to flow, he saw a real opportunity for MMA. And he took it on. I don't know if any of you have read Joel Bakken's book, The Corporation. He's a book, and there was a documentary made. He's recently done a new book called The New Corporation, and there was a documentary that goes along with it. And one of the things he found in the years after he wrote his first one was that the corporate sector was really touting its good corporate citizenship. It wasn't the old corporation that was just profits before everything. And he went to where's that place in Switzerland where they have the World Economic Forum? It's actually on now, and
Davos.
At Davos. There you go. Thank you. And anyways, basically the conclusion was all of these pretenses about the transformation of the corporation into a good corporate citizenship was all bunk. And basically, its character is fundamentally the same, which is the pathological pursuit of profit and power, and that corporations will do good only if it's good for shareholder value. So that's kind of the context and this is the first person you will recognize, or some of you will recognize, that's Tom Harding. He was the conductor, and him and his two fellows were charged criminally after the disaster. So Tom Harding, just to say a few words about the way he was framed. I mean, by this time, as I said, it was the volume of oil by rail traffic, both in Canada and the United States, had multiplied manyfold. Canada went from 500 tank cars to 160,000. In the US, I think it was 9,000 to 415,000. But in any case, he was someone, they had really cut the staff. He was working on his day off. The lead engine was defective, should have been removed. It wasn't removed. He had to park on the track at the top of the hill. He couldn't park it there on the siding because it was being used. He couldn't park it on the flat because it would have crossed a road, et cetera, et cetera. He wanted to go back once he had learned that there was a fire. Once he left the train, there was a fire. It was the firefighters came and they put it out, and there was the only thing holding that train on that steep hill was the independent brake on the locomotive, because the company wouldn't allow him to apply the brakes on the cars, and they wouldn't. They complained that he was applying too many handbrakes. Anyways, they wouldn't let him go back. They said, you have to work the next day, and so forth and so on. So once they turned off the locomotive and the air leaked out, this was 12:58 a.m. On January 5th, on January 6th, and then it started to move. And by the time it hit the curve in the center of town, very sharp curve. It was traveling at 60 miles an hour, and it derailed, and it was just a night. It was just an apocalyptic event. There's a view of Back and Shale from the sky, and a view of the loading terminal at Newtown. And that's a map of the journey. It's about 4,000 kilometers, which I don't know, it's about 1,500 to 2,000 miles from Newtown to Lac Mégantic. So you can see CP goes to Montreal, and then it's picked up by MMA, and then through St. John to the Irving refinery in St. John.
And Bruce,
That's a picture of the curve in the town on the day before. See how sharp it is, and that's a picture of the place, the cafe where most of the people died, and that's a view of the event in progress. And that's a couple of days after. That's a picture of the town center before the disaster. And that's a picture taken, I think it's basically the same. It's just a big open field. There's been reconstruction off to the side, but where the town center was, that's what's there. Whoops, I'll say I wasn't going to move it, but I'll just leave it there because that's all the slides I have. I must be getting close to my time. Jerry, how much time do I have?
yeah, you're about there, but we can take some out of
Yeah.
we've got some wiggle room. So
Yeah, let me just say that I talk a lot about in my book the theme of regulatory capture, the power relationship between the regulator and the regulated industry, and the various dimensions of that. It exists in Canada. It exists in the US. It hasn't changed. There's a revolving door relationship. It's usually, the regulator is usually under-resourced, and there's a kind of a deferential relationship. And that's not what it should be. There should be a relationship of tension. A word about where the buck stops. Yeah, you can take that off. As I said, the 3 frontline workers were criminally charged. No one was held accountable in industry or government. There were a number of civil suits. There were 30 defendants, and they contributed to a settlement. CP was also a defendant. It refused to settle, and believe it or not, they're still in court. There were a number of lesser violations with fines and so forth. Yeah, there was, there was a number of actions, legislation, orders, and so forth that were taken. But this was a time when the industry was deep in lobbying mode and managed to dilute or block or delay a whole range of things which could have been could have increased the safety. I mean, they were doing the same. There was a I'll pass on to the kind of my last segment, which basically is, have the lessons of Lac-Mégantic been learned? Is the transportation of oil by rail safer? Are the tracks sound and well maintained? Are the tank cars sufficiently crash resistant? Has the regulator's safety oversight system improved? Have the railways become more attentive to safety, especially when it conflicts with cost? Has there been a rebalancing of that power relationship between the regulator and the regulated industry? They're huge. As I said, it managed to create a reality in which those safety risks still exist. For example, they're still refusing to implement fatigue management practices. They're still refusing to implement effective whistleblower protections. Municipalities have asked repeatedly for trains to be rerouted, and the safety board, our transportation safety board, recommended it. There's been zero progress on that. We're way behind you on positive train control and EC electro-pneumatic braking systems. I gather you're pretty much there as far as positive train control. So, we don't have allow single person crews anymore, which was the case for Tom Harding. This company should have never been allowed single person crews. Since Lac-Mégantic, there have been 7 major derailments of trains carrying dangerous goods. The most recent was in Saskatchewan. There were actually 2 close together, and together they spilled over 3 million liters of diluted bitumen. And they were using the most crash resistant of tank cars. So, what lessons have been learned? Well, by the regulator or by the industry, I would say their calculations, the probability of a big accident are low. The cost of implementing important safety measures is high, and the cost of potential lawsuits is manageable. What's the price for political leaders and senior officials? No accountability. The transport minister at the time was shuffled off to another portfolio. There were regulations and retirements, but this was all hidden from public. There was no commission of inquiry was authorized. Now, during the pandemic, volumes of oil by rail have been greatly reduced, but they continued to roll through the towns and cities across North America. I'd be interested in your views on the impact of Keystone XL cancellation and what you think that will do for oil by rail. But I would say that the window is still open for history to repeat itself, and that we should not wait for another disaster to rediscover the lessons of Lac-Mégantic, which have not learned.
Thank you so much, Bruce. The family, when I give my presentation, I've got the pictures of the people who were killed in that disaster. This is a very personal story. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you guys please mute if you're not speaking? But yeah, this is a personal story for him. So he knows, he's familiar with that family. Sorry. So I want to move on. Well, and why is this relevant to us? Because we don't want that. We have something that the people of Lac-Mégantic didn't have. We know how dangerous this is, and we right now have a window of opportunity to try to do something about it. And I'll tell you, we didn't hear a lot about that East Chicago derailment, but that could have been a Lac-Mégantic on steroids had that been a worst case scenario, because if that had been a fiery explosive derailment, it was located by fields of petroleum storage facilities, which the media never showed. So next I want to introduce Fritz Elder. He is based in Washington, D.C., and he is a veteran railroader who began working as a rail freight car builder repairer in 1978, and who has worked in many capacities, from maintaining track and bridges to running high-speed trains. Fritz has been a Rail Workers Union officer for decades and is now a special representative for Railroad Workers United, RWU, a North American cross-craft solidarity and advocacy organization. Fritz has broad rail industry knowledge regarding infrastructure, energy, environmental impact, and economics for heavy and light rail, passenger and freight, in both the national and international contexts. Beginning in 2015, Fritz headed the international defense efforts for the rail workers who were scapegoated after the terrible 2013 Lac-Mégantic volatile oil train wreck. It was a victory for rail crews, trackside communities, and the environment when scapegoating by the Canadian government failed. Working at the intersection of the safety needs of rail crews and sustainable communities, Fritz believes that railroads can and must be a crucial part of the green transportation future. Fritz, take it away.
Thank you. The part of the story of the Lac-Mégantic disaster that I am going to mostly speak about tonight is the criminal trial that took place after the disaster. And Bruce has covered all of the most important aspects of the timeline. And but one of the things is that in the minds of most people in North America, in my experience in traveling around the country talking about this and in other forums, is that they do know the name of the town and they do know that a tragedy took place there, but that's usually about the extent of what they really know about it. They don't necessarily know much in terms of the criminal trial that followed. The problem is that there were two sets of lessons that flowed out of that trial. There was one set of lessons for the corporations in this case, railroads and the oil companies and the refineries and associated corporations, and another set of lessons for the working people as a whole, the people who actually work in those industries, and for the trackside communities. There was a criminal trial that took place in the years following the disaster, in which 3 employees of the railroad, 2 regular employees and 1 low-level boss were charged criminally. And they were the only ones, as Bruce has already covered in his narrative. And then after months of trial and testimony, they were finally acquitted of criminal charges. And that was, without any kind of qualification, a victory. But there was more to it in context. The short version is that for the corporations that continue up till right now, up till today, in those operations that were very much like the one in Lac-Mégantic, they were confirmed in their belief that there will be no real consequences for the practices that led up to the wreck, no real penalties of consequence. And it's a terrible thing in a sense that we have to say that that is one of the lessons of the trials of Lac-Mégantic, because accountability was just really not there for those institutions. And it was also not there for the regulators, the government entities that were charged with, and the people had a right to expect that those entities would have been looking out for their best interests and protecting them. There were no consequences. No one who really cares about justice wants scapegoat trials. But ironically enough, it's true that the trial is where all of the details of the out of control dangerous practices were revealed. You know, those of us in the industry, Railroad Workers United and others, we certainly didn't want to see our coworkers put on trial. But in the absence of a commission of inquiry, which was one of the demands that the people of Lac-Mégantic and people interested in rail safety had called for, the trial was really the place where it was possible, and that some of the information that we now have, as Jerry points out, we know stuff that they didn't know. The trial was where this information came out. The decision had been made to single out black workers in a chain of ridiculously dangerous and deliberate decisions and scapegoat them. I mean, just, you know, for example, that they made all the decisions about the transport through this community with a single employee crew member, unable to do any of the protective things that Bruce just mentioned. And for example, they had no plan whatsoever. They didn't even have a bad plan for a fire, which is just a remarkable thing when you're talking about basically for the first time in an industry, making big unit consists, trains that consisted exclusively of the some of the most volatile and dangerous products that we'd ever carried by rail. To not have a plan for those kinds of eventualities is an example of the cavalier way that they had operated. And we have to say that there were no consequences for them for that. The same social actors, the carriers and their pocket regulators, the regulatory authorities that are really subject to political interference and whatnot, those same social actors that excused the Lac-Mégantic wreck and tried to single out the last people in the chain, Tom Harding and Richard Labrie in particular, are the ones who will continue to kill the workers, kill the towns, and kill the earth if nothing is done about that. And that may sound like hyperbole, but it's actually not when you get into the details of it. That's the reason why these lessons are so crucial. It's another reason why it's our duty to make sure that the story of what happened in Lac-Mégantic is not forgotten. Those of us who do this work, we routinely run up against a degree of a problem where we'll talk about it and people will say, yeah, well, for us in the United States. That happened in another country. It happened in 2013. What about now? What about something now? But we have to make sure that story is never forgotten. The real story, the story of how it happened when it shouldn't have, there's no reason for it to have happened. That must not be forgotten. And thankfully, we have two great authors on this panel tonight that have both written on the subject, and that we have that in part to thank for in order to help us to make sure that these are not ever forgotten. For the rail workers and the refinery workers and all the others along the supply chain, as well as the trackside communities, the trackside communities gained nothing from the volatile crude by rail that passed through Lac-Mégantic, for example. And it's interesting that when Bruce referred to the Robert Bellefleur in his letter, when he talked about some of the renewable energy issues, that's a wonderful thing. What he didn't say is that the town of Lac-Mégantic got zero, zip, zilch, nothing from the transport of the volatile crude through that community. They didn't get any energy. They didn't get any money. They didn't get any jobs. They didn't get anything, zero, in return for putting them at the kind of risk that they were put at. And for me, I had an example of this myself, which was when I returned on the night before May 1st, 2016, I believe it was. I came back from Lac-Mégantic, where I had been working together with the people there on making sure that we did an effective defense and an effective expose of these stories. And in my hometown of Washington, D.C., we had a freight train derail in the middle of the town, and I got woken up early that morning to have to respond to that, where we had a very near disaster. It was bad enough as it was, but we had a very near disaster. And again, the community that I live in is one that gets zero, zilch, zip, no benefit whatsoever from the transport of these products in that manner. Without the trial, we would not know most of about what happened. The continuing call for a full commission of public inquiry never got answered. There were two more or less formal investigations, but they both were limited, and they both had issues of political influence that made them inadequate. So in the actual trial itself, I believe there were 41 witnesses that were called by the government. And as it turned out, each of those witnesses, and I was fortunate enough to be able to attend a couple of sessions of the trial, each of those 41 witnesses, in the vernacular, spilled the beans, if we can say that, in the sense that they were supposed to be giving evidence of why these workers should be the ones held responsible, but they actually exposed all kinds of practices, not the least of which were not, the industry self-regulated about things like how much of the volatile crude could be loaded into a particular tank car that had a weight limit, but that left a volume, and they didn't see any reason why they shouldn't just use that volume. So since they were policing themselves, they just went ahead and filled it up. Many other examples of this kind. So the transcripts of the trial were really revealing about details that we would never otherwise have known about. One of the primary lessons is that who has the power to control the story about what people hear and what is their motivation. In the immediate aftermath of the wreck, a guy that Bruce referred to, Ed Burkhart, came to town, and the MMA, the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railroad, initially basically claimed that it was a terrible thing, but that they had done everything they could properly, and that even Tom Harding had done everything that he was supposed to do. But within a couple of days, they started figuring out that they could blame everything on him, the last guy in the chain, the only person or one of us, there's a whole layer of people at the bottom who have no control over everything, but they figured out that they could do this. And one of the main reasons that they figured out they could do this is because the MMA had a kind of a monopoly power to control the narrative as it was presented, as it unfolded, based on the fact that they were the railroad and they were the people who supposedly, the people deferred to them to get information. And they could also have complete control over, who profited, who didn't. And that is normally the way it happens. That's normally the way it happens with wrecks wherever they take place. The thing that was really special in this case, and that's one of the important stories here, is that the people living in the town of Lac-Mégantic, for their own reasons, for their own experience, had an existing basis of distrusting the narrative and the power of the railroad. This is really pretty unique. Most places in the world, that's not the case. But because the people there immediately and at a gut level believed that the wrong people were being scapegoated, it provided an opportunity to do a community-based defense that combined the technical and legal aspects of defending them, and understand, those of us who were really involved in the political defense of these guys, we didn't really do anything. We made sure that the truth and the story came out, and we did everything we could about that. There was an important legal and technical aspect to that, and other people were the main people who did that. But we were able to combine a political and international defense for those guys with the needs of the public, not just the needs of the public of the town, but also the needs of the public everywhere in North America, to understand the dangers that the government and the corporations had put them in. And it was a steadfast, the thing is that the people of that town steadfastly refused to blame the guys that were on trial. It would have been very easy and very common, the way it happens in most places, for them to eventually, they may have initially had some distrust about policies. They could have just switched over to that and said, well, let's get, these guys, and then everything will go back to normal. But that isn't what happened. And we're all grateful that that was the situation, because it would have been an even worse tragedy if we had not been able to expose those things. It's an outrage that the only people who have zero power to determine dangerous policies are the ones that get singled out by the government for criminalization. And that's true in general for not only, it's true in the communities that are alongside the track community, but also for the railroad workers in those situations. They're not involved at any point along the entire line in the decision-making process, and in most cases, even in the carrying out of the policies. They're not the ones who have that power. Those decisions are always made by others. Turns out that the people in Quebec and around the world were hungry to know what actually was going on, and who was paying attention, and whether or not we are left safe. Took 47 people killed, and then another 3 who died in related ways in the years after that. A town destroyed and a trial in order for most of that information to come out, so that we can have a conversation about these still existing conditions today. That's why we can't move on. That's why we cannot forget the story of the town of Lac-Mégantic. Today, the town there still wants justice, and they want peace. And as we speak, they still are denied their bypass. There's a process going on there that has been drawn out for a long time. And at the same time, a lot of the major players, certainly the biggest players with regard to the volatile oil shipments and stuff, are free and actually are looking at a new wave of transfer of that kind of material through that part of the world. The Canadian Pacific has reacquired this trackage that once was theirs and that they had spun off. And they're pretty straightforward about the fact that they see a bright future, a bright, profitable future in transport along that route that will probably at some point involve the same kinds of stuff. In this context where there really hasn't been the kind of accountability that we needed. So the workers in these dangerous processes, whether it be in the refineries or in the transport or in the conversion or in the actual rail part, they have to be they have to be stakeholders. They have to be stakeholders in the process of who makes the decisions. Those decisions right now get made by people in the corporate offices and to a certain extent by their pocket regulators. And we've seen now, and the lesson of this is that we cannot afford to let that continue to be the case. We have to have public stakeholdership. We have to have the employees in that situation as well. We've seen that the watchdog agencies that are supposed to do the oversight, may not be doing their job. So that's one of the reasons why forums like this are real important. And there's a lot more we could talk about this. I think we can reserve at least my portion of that for question and answers if people have it. But I'll just turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Fritz. So what we see here is insult after injury. And the reoccurring theme, time and time again, accountability, which leaves the problem in our hands, in the public hands. What I'm putting in the chat is a link to a webpage that everybody here that's presenting has in some way contributed to. And there is an action plan that you can take a look at. Bill, if there are any questions about that. We're going to move on. We've got, so Justin probably doesn't realize this, but he taught me almost everything I know about what's going on here in the US. You know, after I learned about Lackawanna Antique, the next person I came across, well, I didn't know Justin by name at the time, but I did know about his blog with his work on DeSmog blog. Justin McCullough is an investigative journalist for the independent news research organization DeSmog and author of the book Bomb Trains, How Industry Greed and Regulatory Failure Put the Public at Risk. For the past 5 years, or it's probably 6 now, Justin has reported on the growing threat of explosive oil and ethanol trains in North America. McCullough holds a degree in He currently lives in Trumansburg, New York, and I am posting links to both Justin's and Bruce's book in the chat in case you guys would like to take a look at it. Both of the books are extraordinarily well written and have some very valuable information that they're packed with. Thank you so much, Justin, for joining us today.
Thanks, Jerry. Good to see everyone again. The last time I saw a lot of these people was in October of 2019, where we did a similar presentation in the Chicago area. What we didn't know at the time was that we've since learned that that meeting and presentation was on the radar of the U.S. security complex in some way, because what had happened was the Association of American Railroads, the main lobbying group that has fought any real safety regulation, apparently had been tracking me and my work and referring to that as a threat to the North American rail industry. And one of the way we learned about this is some hackers actually hacked one of these national security databases. Someone who knew my work saw that there were presentations about it relating to this. Bruce got a mention in it as well, but they specifically mentioned that we would be meeting in Chicago in October 2019. So they had been watching us. We are the threat to them because we're telling the truth. And so I don't know if they're here tonight, but if they are, welcome. And we're still doing our work. So thank you, Bruce and Fritz, for that overview. I won't talk about Lac-Mégantic much, but I will start off with it because right after the accident in Lac-Mégantic, the Wall Street Journal ran an article where an oil executive said they weren't sure what happened because crude oil does not explode like that. And so that oil executive, they were trying to figure out why downtown Lac-Mégantic had especially been blown off the map from an oil train. And this executive said, well, crude oil doesn't explode like that. Something else must have happened. Fritz mentioned how the industry likes to control the narrative. That's probably the last time the oil industry told the truth about this whole situation. Because crude oil does not explode like that, but the Bakken crude oil is not just oil. It has natural gas liquids in it, like propane and butane. And that's what caused the scale of the damage in Lac-Mégantic and in the many subsequent accidents. That is the number one risk about transporting oil by rail. And while that, once the industry learned, and we began to learn about that risk and what was going on, the industry took the approach essentially of what I like to call the big lie. And they just started lying about Bakken crude oil, the safety of it. One of the biggest lies was that they said the oil industry didn't really understand crude oil, so they needed to study it a lot more for years until they could have any real regulations. So this was very effectively controlling the narrative by lying, and that's been their approach ever since. But the main thing that we're talking about all of this is because that Bakken oil comes out of the ground. It's fracked oil is much lighter, and a lot of natural gas liquids like propane and butane come out of the ground with the oil. And so making it much more volatile, which means if it spills, it ignites very easily. And so that's where the risk comes in. This could be very easily addressed. The industry does it when they ship oil in ocean-going tankers or put it in the pipeline. They do something called stabilizing the oil, where they remove the propane and butane. The industry actually has had some brief moments of honesty about this and why they refuse to do it, which is the oil is more valuable for refineries if it has the propane and butane in it. So for them to make a profit, they have to keep the oil in this more volatile and dangerous state. So it's very simply, they have said, in order to make a profit, the public will be put at risk. And so that's what we're dealing with here. And that is really the main thing. If they did address this, we wouldn't continue to be seeing these trains derail and catch fire. An example, unfortunately, we have another recent example of a Bakken oil train derailing and catching fire. It happened in Custer, Washington, right before Christmas. This example, there's a lot about this train. Thankfully, no one was harmed. But this is another example of everything that's wrong with the regulatory process and why these trains should not be running and why they have to regulate the volatility of this oil. The train was going 7 miles per hour. It had the latest supposedly safe tank cars. It was on a flat, straight section of track. This is like the lowest risk scenario there is, although it was in the middle of Custer, the small town where it happened. Even going 7 miles per hour on a flat track, the tanks ruptured once it derailed. The oil caught fire. They had to evacuate the town. Thankfully, no one was harmed. But this goes to show that everything they talk about making these trains safer, there's nothing they can do until they make this oil they remove these dangerous natural gas liquids so that the oil doesn't catch fire every time one of these trains derails. And thankfully, this was a smaller scale accident because it was only going 7 miles per hour. But so from what we know from this is these tank cars are unsafe at any speed. These trains can derail anywhere at slow speeds. So we have to plan and regulate against the worst case scenarios. And the one way to do that is really to address, to not be moving this dangerous oil. The same is true about the oil moved in Canadian oil trains. But the other reason why this example in Washington shows what's so wrong with our regulatory system is Washington State knew this. They've done the work, and unlike a lot of the other areas, especially during the pandemic, where oil by rail traffic has gone down, Washington State has 5 oil refineries that use large amounts of Bakken oil. It only gets there by rail, and they've continued to get that oil throughout this. So it's no surprise that there was an accident in Washington because they've been moving, they continue to move the same amounts of oil there by rail. In 2019, Washington State passed regulations saying, if you want to bring this oil to our refineries, you have to remove the natural gas liquids and lower the volatility. The one thing I've been writing about and talking about ever since Loch McGantic. It's what we know will greatly reduce the risk of moving this oil. So they weren't saying ban the oil, they're just saying make it safe so it doesn't ignite and explode in populated areas. What happened was the regulatory agency under the Trump administration overruled Washington State. And in doing so, they said, as a state, we're not allowing you to regulate this because it's coming, it's multi-states, it's coming from North Dakota to your state. But the reasoning that they used for why that Washington State couldn't regulate was they said that safety could not be a pretext for limiting market growth. So this organization, the actual organization that regulates oil by rail and pipelines, is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. But their lawyer last year wrote his opinion that safety could not be a reason to regulate the industry. So at that point, we're basically looking at regulations that there's really no point in having regulatory agencies with safety in the name if they're saying they don't even consider that anymore, if it might cut into profits. That's where we are. Unfortunately, the last 4 years have been a disaster from a regulatory standpoint. Not only did PHMSA say that safety is not a pretext for regulations and overruling Washington in that case, but earlier several states, Illinois being one of them, had tried to get regulations for 2-person crews for freight trains moving hazardous materials. When PHMSA under the Trump administration also overrode that, the statement with that said it actually came from the Federal Railroad Administration at this point, which oversees PHMSA. It said the regulatory approach for the Federal Railroad Administration is to remove regulations that are in the way of, that are burdensome, that are in the way essentially of industry profits, but also and allow the industry to volunteer to make any safety improvements. So they were true to their word. In the 4 years, there were no new safety regulations for moving oil by rail, but the one actually very important safety regulation that came out of the Obama administration was to require modernized electronically controlled pneumatic or ECP brakes for these oil trains. And the industry fought that, and the Trump administration once again lied about the science, as that has been the approach about all of this, and they repealed that. So in the past 4 years, what we've seen is there were attempts to regulate volatility by the states. That was overruled. There was real regulation that was going to require them to modernize the braking systems. That was overruled. And so we've been in a deregulatory environment, and so things essentially have gotten worse. To add on to that, the one thing that the PHMSA and the Federal Railroad Administration did do was new regulations to allow the movement of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, by rail. Now, this was fast-tracked. Actually, President Trump had an executive order like 2 years ago saying, we want this, which is very rare for an executive order to be related to rail regulations. But we want this to happen and happen within 13 months. It happened basically on that timeline, which is very fast for new regulations allowing the movement of hazardous materials by rail. So they fast tracked it, but it didn't sneak up on people like the oil issue did, where most people weren't aware of the risk of oil by rail until Lac-Mégantic happened. And people started asking questions about these mile-long black trains that were driving through their towns. That's how I learned about it. I lived in Albany, New York at the time of Lac-Mégantic, and Albany was the largest oil train hub on the East Coast. But so now they have moved forward with LNG by rail. But once it was announced that they were planning to do this and on a short timeline, there was a lot of opposition, unlike with oil by rail. So before these trains could be approved, 16 state attorneys general wrote letters opposing it. Groups like Earth Justice, Center for Biological Diversity wrote large comments opposing it. And the National Transportation Safety Board wrote very strong comments saying, we do not think this is a good idea to put LNG on the train tracks with no serious new safety regulations. So unfortunately, the National Transportation Safety Board, they're the ones who investigate after there are bad accidents involving these trains, but they have no enforcement capability or regulatory power. So what they do is warn about things, and if history is any guide, then those things happen, and then people talk about addressing it. We haven't had a bad accident yet with LNG by rail, thankfully, because they haven't been moving any of it yet. But so all of these groups oppose this justifiably, because the idea of moving LNG on the train tracks is absolutely insane. It's incredibly dangerous. All of that got ignored because that's how our regulatory system works right now, and that was approved. To further highlight how broken our regulatory system is, at the same time that they approved LNG by rail in July, that was the same time PHMSA released its draft report on the safety of LNG by rail. So PHMSA was supposed to be studying how safe this was and released the report on that draft at the same time they approved the regulation. They also announced that there would be a new group working with the National Academy of Sciences to spend the next 2 years studying ways, looking at the safety of LNG by rail. So it is perfectly legal right now to fill a train of 100 cars or more with LNG and drive it across this country with no speed limits, but a recommended speed limit of 50 miles per hour. And yet now is when they are talking about, well, is this safe? So it's hard to comprehend this is how the system works, but it does, and that's why there is so much risk. 2 weeks ago, PHMSA and the National Academy of Sciences had their first public meetings on this to discuss this. And there was an exchange in those meetings that pretty much summed up all of the problems, where someone from the National Academy of Sciences asked the lead person from PHMSA, what is the one thing that we could, that the most important thing to reduce the risk of accidents regarding LNG by rail? And this person, who's a lawyer, responded, training. Said human error is the leading cause of accidents, and I think everyone would agree with me on that. No one agrees with him on that. Who knows what they're talking about? And if you go through, and I published an article about this today, actually on DeSmog, you can read more of the details, but almost all of the major accidents involving oil by rail trains, where there have been large spills and fires, it's been track defects or some failure. Has nothing to do with the people who are operating the train. But this is a classic example over and over again of the big lie approach, where they redirect and say, well, if we just train people better, it won't be risky. The risks of LNG rail cannot be minimized by training. Good training, well-rested employees, critical to safety. But the best well-rested employees operating a train pulling 100 LNG cars can't do a damn thing if the track fails, which is normally how these accidents happen. So PHMSA, once again, thankfully we have a new administration coming in, but the regulatory agencies, unfortunately in the US, and as Bruce mentioned, it's very similar in Canada, they work hand in hand with industry to try to control the narrative, to delay a lot of the what they've done with regulations about oil trains specifically has just been delay and say we need to study this more, we don't understand oil. It works. They keep running the trains. We keep seeing accidents like we just saw in December because nothing has essentially changed since Lac-Mégantic, other than the new tank cars were the one big safety improvement. And yet we see those fail even at 7 miles per hour in an accident on a straight, flat piece of track. So we're not looking at anything safer than what happened in Lac-Mégantic. They've successfully fought the braking regulations, and now we're looking at LNG by rail. The only upside about LNG by rail compared to oil by rail is, as I mentioned earlier, at least we know about it beforehand. There are lawsuits that have been filed by Earth Justice and others to challenge this. And the new administration, it has specifically said they are looking at this regulation as something that may need to be addressed. Unfortunately, since it was done in July, the clock has run out for Congress to just repeal it. So what will be required is going through a whole new regulatory process, which typically, when done right, takes more than 13 months. It could be 2 or 3 years. But the hope right now is that because the industry knows that there's potential that it could be repealed, there isn't any demand or the required tank cars to be moving a lot of LNG on the rails in the next couple of years. So while this regulation is in place and allows it, and it's very flawed, and there's real risk to the public if this ever happens, hopefully it won't be a huge risk in the next couple of years, and ideally this administration will repeal the regulation and not allow it. So that's the good news. We haven't had a lot of good news. I mean, we're coming off of 4 years of a deregulatory environment. A lot of damage has been done. We don't know who the new leadership of PHMSA will be, but the old leadership was former rail executives. So they certainly were in favor of rail company management decisions. But there is good news. The fact that reports have already said that the Biden administration is specifically looking at LNG by rail. Hopefully they will also look at limiting the volatility of crude oil that can be moved by rail. There was a regulation proposed at the end of the Obama administration to do just that. The Trump administration just essentially threw that out when they also overrode Washington State. The bad news is all the same lobbyists are still working. All the same politicians are involved. The big lie approach has been successful. It's recently been used in U.S. electoral politics relatively successfully. So the system is broken. We have some room for hope, but a lot of the elements that are in place are still in the favor of industry. And the only thing that has it made the public safer when it comes to the issue of moving oil by rail, has been successful activism that has blocked a lot of new oil by rail infrastructure. That has been the only thing. I expect that will be what drives future improvements in safety. So it's really about people pressuring their Congress people, talking to your Attorney General. These are the people who have power in this process and may have some influence. In another category of good news, bad news, Dakota Access Pipeline today, the company behind it lost another lawsuit. They don't actually have permits to operate that. That's good in one sense, but that means very likely that more Bakken oil will be back on the rails because the Dakota Access was moving a lot of Bakken. In a similar vein, the KXL pipeline being no longer going to happen, that likely won't have a large immediate impact on the amount of crude oil moving by rail. But it certainly, if KXL had gone forward, it would have reduced the likelihood of large volumes of crude oil returning to the rails in Canada. One upside of the pandemic has been essentially Canada was moving 400 or 450,000 barrels per day of oil by rail right before the pandemic hit. That went down to 40,000 barrels a day 6 months into the pandemic. It's really essentially stopped that practice. And this will end with because we don't talk enough about the risks. I mean, Bruce has, but Lac Megantic was American oil. That wasn't Canadian oil. But the oil being moved from Canada to U.S., through Canada and through much of the U.S., the Canadian oil is just as dangerous as the Bakken oil. And because it's very volatile because of what they dilute the oil with. And over the course of the last 7 years when I've worked on this, the leading industry publication is Railway Age. And they're very supportive of pretty much anything the rail industry says. But they have broken with the rail industry on saying that the volatility of Bakken oil should be regulated. But also, Bruce mentioned that right at the end of 2019 and then in early 2020, 2 Canadian oil trains derailed because of track defects right around the same town, within a month of each other. And that led to Railway Age writing an editorial, again, saying that the industry needs to address the products that it's moving because it referred to these oil trains as a clear and present danger. And I think that that's accurate. And that's what we continue to face because we're now coming up on the 8th anniversary of Lac Megantic. The regulatory system has failed us to protect the public. And the risks remain. If LNG by rail actually becomes a thriving industry, the risks will be greatly a whole nother level. So I think these issues, there's so much going on right now. I don't think these issues are getting a lot of attention, but we did just have another derailment. But at least I am optimistic that the Biden administration knows about this and that it hopefully Secretary Buttigieg will address the LNG by rail. It seems like it's going to be a top priority for it to be reviewed. That said, it can never hurt to remind any politicians that they should support that. So thank you.
Wow, thank you, Justin. So Justin and Bruce stayed at my home last time they were here. I'm gonna have to check and make sure my phones aren't tapped. I can't say as I saw any terrorism or terroristic activity going on, but they did eat a lot of turkey tetrazzini. So, as an educator, my concern is the schools and the children and the parents who have no clue that their kids could be at risk. And in addition to the LNG and the Bakken crude and the tar sands oil, we also have anhydrous ammonia, ethylene oxide, and a number of others types of very toxic and explosive types of chemicals. There are 14,800 schools and 5.7 million students within the oil train blast zone. Chicago, with 77,000 kids at school in that zone, is one of the top 5 U.S. cities having school children at risk from oil train derailments and explosions. In my own district, Prospect High School is in the oil train blast zone. Wheeling High School is in the oil train blast zone. Stevenson High School, Lake Zurich High School, they are all in the oil train blast zone, and that is just a drop in the bucket of the number of schools that have children at risk from a serious Lochner-Gantique type of explosion. I've worked with Senator Julie Morrison and Senator Laura Murphy. We do now in Illinois have a resolution. It's a resolution on the books to include school personnel in emergency response plans specific to the storage and transport of hazardous materials. A resolution is basically a suggestion. We still need a bill. I've worked with Tommy Brown, a legislative aide who has transportation issues for Congressman Brad Schneider. He's working with the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and he states that he has drawn up a similar bill, and he states that revisiting our bill is on my list in the coming weeks. Hope to have more for you come February. So, you know, I'm going to have some asks, and I'm going to put them in the chat. First of all, please take a look at our detailed action plan. Contact Congressman Brad Schneider's office and ask him to please introduce a hazardous materials near schools bill. And I'll put his contact information in the chat. And contact our local school boards and demand transparent emergency response plans for a worst case scenario specific to the transport and storage of hazardous materials, and refer to the bill. It's called SR 0982. Yes, SR 0982. Hazardous materials near schools, because they're not going to know what you're talking about. But we need to make them aware of these things. So I did put the asks in the, I believe they're all there, in the chat. Next, I want to introduce a couple of members from Railroad Workers United. The first is Mark Burroughs. He is from Chicago and is a 40-year veteran, Canadian Pacific Railroad locomotive engineer who was an active member of SMART TV, formerly United Transportation Union Local 1433, who served as a delegate for his union's international convention. Since 2011, Mark has been working with Railroad Workers United, an organization formed to bring unity to the voices of the many different unions representing railroad workers in order to more effectively fight for improved safety for railroad workers and the public. He formerly served as organizer and member of the steering committee for this organization and still contributes articles to its quarterly newsletter, The Highball. In his retirement, Mark continues to work to raise awareness among the public about these issues. Mark?
Thank you very much. First I want to say it's always an honor to be on a program with Bruce and Justin, as well as Jerry, Fritz. So thank you for the invite. And I just kind of want to connect some dots from my perspective, having worked in the rail industry starting in 1974. So I've kind of seen the degradation, been a part of the degradation of our working conditions over that time. Justin talked about the big lie, and meetings like this are very important. It give us an opportunity to chip away to establish our version of the narrative, to tell our version of the story. And yeah, it's not a pretty picture, even with the Biden administration coming in. We have a lot of work to do, but all we can do is keep doing what we're doing, bit by bit, public meeting by public meeting, and all the other resources that we have to get out. Bruce talked about the pathological quest for profits. Something to that effect. It may not be the verbatim quote, but and that's what we're talking about here. so though Lac Magentic happened 7 years ago, and again, I want to reiterate Bruce's point, what's been said, that the lessons of this have not been learned and therefore not implemented. And so in essence, something like this could happen once again, anytime, anywhere. For those of us rail labor union activists who have been fighting and fighting for safety for years and decades, something like Lac Magentic was always kind of a worse fear for us. We always knew something like this could happen, and so it was a real punch in the gut to us when this happened, and it just deepened our resolve. It just deepened our resolve to learn the truth and get out the truth and talk about our side of the story. Lac Magentic is a poster child for what can happen when a perfect storm of all the various manifestations of speed up come together. And by speed up, I mean basically more work, more productivity with less people. In a manufacturing industry, that equates to cranking up the assembly line. And something like Amazon is a perfect example of speed up. Just crank it up, and the consequences are more workers get injured and they get tossed off to the side, and there's more waiting for that job. But in the rail industry, the manifestations of speed up, when everything comes together, we have a situation like Lac Magentic that threatens workers as well as the public. A few of the basic manifestations of speed up in the rail industry, since we don't have an assembly line to crank up: long and heavy trains. Once upon a time, 5,000 to 7,000 feet trains were considered kind of long, quite a bit to handle. Now they're over 20,000 feet. So that's saving 3 crews. And just like anything in any industry, blood money overtime to pay for a reduced workforce is simply more cost effective than paying the benefits for an adequately staffed workforce. So there's, why 2 mile, 20,000, 2 mile long, 20,000 foot trains? That pathological quest for profits. And that comes into play with Lac Magentic because not only was it a heavy train, but the single employee crew was a factor, that he was working by himself. Bruce mentioned that there was the possibility of parking the train on the siding in the flat. Well, number one, I think one of those tracks was being used as a storage track, but one of the reasons they couldn't park it on a safer area was because they would have had to cut a crossing. Well, if they'd had a conductor with, then they could have cut the crossing. So once again, speed up rears its ugly head. Fewer crews working longer hours, fatigue, deferred maintenance. Justin mentioned several times many incidents where track defects, deferred maintenance, as well as deferred maintenance of the rolling stock, the freight cars themselves, as well as the infrastructure. Single employee crews. This is going to be a very important fight. They kind of had to back down in Canada as a result of Lac Magentic. But the carriers, make no mistake, the carriers are pushing for single employee crews, and that will be a battle looming on the horizon. And anybody who's concerned about safe railroad operations, we will need the public support to push back on that when that inevitably comes to a head. In the context of the COVID plague, on top of all these other speed up that have been, the carriers have been riding roughshod on speed up ever since the 80s. Bruce made mention of Hunter Harrison and his precision scheduled railroading business model, and essentially Hunter Harrison and PSR just simply ramped up the concept of speed up, just cranked it up to 11 on and on overdose steroids. It was already in place in the industry, and Hunter Harrison and company, the Burkharts, just took it to another level. And then on top of it, in the context of the COVID plague, the rail carriers were able to get an exemption from the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, for a range of safety rule exemptions, cutbacks that had been in place for decades, those remain in effect to this day. As Jerry mentioned, I just kind of want to touch upon this, that even before we had exploding oil trains, we had the dangers of ammonia and chlorine, and continue to this day, and other hazardous materials. But ammonia and chlorine stand out because I know of some instances. If an ammonia or chlorine car opens up, it's instant death for anybody anywhere nearby. And so even if the oil trains and LNG trains stop tomorrow, we'd still have the problem of anybody living anywhere near a rail yard or a main line, a railroad main line, could still be in very much in harm's way. All the schools and along the main lines would still be in harm's way because of these hazardous materials, in combination with just the rogue, reckless, sociopathic quest for profits that govern how the railroads are running. I think I'm gonna wrap it up and leave it there to leave time for more questions and answers, and address some of these things in more detail as applicable. But the bottom line is we're fighting for safety for not only ourselves as workers, and we've always known that the public has a vested interest in safe railroad operations. But the Lac-Megantic incident became a poster child so that the public is much more aware of that, and the public is much more receptive to understanding the hazards that we all face just as the public, and it's going to take a tremendous unity, solidarity of fighting rail workers, along with a fighting with the public, fighting for its right to not have these hazards in their backyard. And this goes along. We know there's a lot wrong in society, and it's more than just this. This is just one particular manifestation, and it's going to take, in my opinion, a broad movement to challenge how these corporations put our lives in jeopardy in various manifestations. And so I want to thank everybody that a meeting like this is a contribution in that process of badly long overdue needed resistance. So I'll leave it there, and more things can be covered in subsequent question and answer.
Thank you so much, Mark. We're going to be joined by Michelle Burke. She is our technology goddess. She is a rail crew transportation driver and transports mostly Indiana Harbor crews around the Chicago area. She is currently attending training for advanced certification in tech support. So she is going to be joining Bruce, Fritz, Justin, and Mark in a Q&A. So if you have any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself. And let's see, I'm trying to see them. Charles, I recognize that name. How are you?
Good, and yourself? Good.
Very good,
program.
thank you.
This question, general question. Is there any other commodity transported by rail for which the government regulates or restricts the route?
Well, maybe the trucking industry does. I don't know for sure, but there are some regulations on hazardous materials by trucking, but I don't know specifics. But I know that some of the tractor trailer guys are specific crews that have been trained in safety. But how much that is known, I don't know. But there's a little.
I'm not aware of any real regulations for rail. Mark mentioned chlorine and ammonia. Those are moved in much smaller volumes than oil, but I don't know whether they allowed us to go directly through populated areas. I believe they do. But in the hearings earlier this month about LNG by rail, PHMSA looked a lot at trucking. And one of the things they mentioned, because LNG is moved in trucks now, and they mentioned that trucks, typically don't carry hazardous materials directly through populated areas. They go around them. And train tracks do typically go right through the middle of cities like Chicago. And Philadelphia, actually, there was a special permit granted before LNG by rail was approved. One company was given the right to move it, and Philadelphia was on the route that they were going to be taking. So I don't think that I don't know of any examples in covering this now for 7 years. I've never heard of other examples where they pointed to that they're moving dangerous goods around cities or populated areas. The only thing they've done in the U.S. with oil was some very weak speed limit regulations for the biggest cities. But as I noted earlier, if a train can derail at 7 miles per hour on a flat track and that causes a spill and fire, limiting the speed limit to 40 miles per hour does not do anything.
Let me just jump in on that real quickly. And I had meant to answer Mark's question about are we trained? But first on the regulation, there really is not, to the best of my knowledge, any specific regulation. I mean, I used to, we would just know that when we would go over our train list, we would know that, we had ammonia or we had chlorine, and then our job was, heaven forbid there was an incident, then the conductor would assuming that we survived, then the conductor could give the train list to the first responders and point out where the hazardous cargo is. And now the one thing they did after 9/11, they started getting concerned about terrorism. And so whereas we used to, it would be nothing to leave a train parked for another crew. Maybe the crew died for time and had to, just like the Lock Magentic train. They started with, if you had really super hazardous materials, now you can't leave that train. You have to sit with it. And that means crews end up sitting on for 14, 16 hours until another crew comes. But that's really the only regulation that I can speak to in terms of the hazardous commodities. As for the training, we're not trained. We're given obligatory classes, every few years that yes, this is what we're supposed to do. But in terms of any real training, meaningful training, no.
It seems to me that, and I don't really know what the cost of it would be, but it seems to me like there's minimal cost to have training on some of this stuff, and it would be a very good investment. I mentioned that the leaking tank cars with vinyl chloride in them in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, it volatilizes and gets in the air, and you don't want to breathe that. And the first responders or the volunteer fire department people had no idea how to deal with it. They're out wandering around in clouds of gas. So, there's a lot of areas that we could be training people in without too much cost, I think, that would be a very good investment.
Hey, Mark, this is Jim. I just want to thank you for setting this up tonight. It is very timely. I was I was on your meeting, and I was on a Barrington Plan Commission meeting that was in reviewing their environmental plan. And this presentation made me think that the Barrington Environmental Plan includes absolutely nothing about the bomb trains that go through probably 24 a day through Barrington or more. And the Canadian Northern is planning to increase that because they're going to add a double track south of Barrington to allow both directions more often. So I've just written a letter to the lady that's writing the plan that she should consider including something about this. And like you said, first responder training. So this is very timely for me. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I think the police and fire department, the first responder people, would be happy to know about some of this stuff because they don't know what they're going to get into. And on the trains, I was going down to my little part-time job at the LL Bean store in South Barrington, and here comes one of those big oil trains, or something like that. A lot of tank cars, and out front ahead of it, it did have a safety car running ahead of it a quarter mile ahead. So I thought that was at least good. And that's some of the things that the rails sometimes do. And I knew, there's some bad on those rail cars, but at least they're trying to be safe. But that's, I think we could do a lot more without too much cost.
It's just a follow up. That was another thing that the recent accident in Washington highlighted again. I've written about other accidents where the first responders didn't know what they were dealing with. And because these trains are so long, there was one incident that happened in Lynchburg, Virginia. And so the derailment happened in the middle of the train. First responders were there. The locomotive was a mile away. And so they couldn't talk to the locomotive, the guy operating the locomotive. But they didn't have any training. And so, again, the training could be as simple as the first responders who got in Custer, Washington, said they responded. They have an app they've been given that's supposed to tell them and help them figure out what's on the train. They ended up getting it by fax. That's how they found out from the railroad. But the lack of training is evident. I'm by no means an expert, but I know a lot about this subject. If I see a placard on the side of a train that says 1267 and it's in Washington State, I know it's Bakken oil. That's just there. It's 95%. It might be from Canada, which also would be dangerous, but 95% of that is Bakken oil. First thing you do is evacuate everyone. They didn't know that. And so those basic things, I mean, that should be just the basic knowledge of any first responders. They don't know it. And, the rail industry they do a great job of public relations. They do big, press events where they show that they're training local first responders. But the fact that at this point in this, first responders did not realize immediately. In Washington, this is a big issue there locally. This isn't the first time it's happened. The last train was in Oregon, right across from Washington, across the Columbia River Gorge. But yeah, there's clearly a lot more that could be done. But the industry, as with all of this, they do the least possible.
But I do want to point out that Fritz mentioned that he had to organize his own training. That's in the chat.
A question for Mark Burrows. Mark, can trains be routed around major metropolitan areas rather than through? I mean, is that an alternative?
I mean,
Bill, the Canadian Northern that goes through Barrington was a reroute, so the trains would not have to go through the more populated areas in Western Chicago, all that area. So that's a reroute, but it's going through my town now.
And that's the one that goes, the EJ&E, that goes right by my house. So yeah, and it never decreased the train traffic through Chicago like they said it was supposed to. They just had more ways to ship it.
Yeah, they're able to buy the CN had a tremendous incentive because getting a freight train through Chicago, just like the Jane Byrne interchange is a major cluster. As you get when you get around to the Belt Railway, all the railroads converge there, and it's really a cluster. That's why there's talk about a flyover. They're working on a flyover and stuff like that. But the situation that Jerry described, where 5 trains turned into 20, that was the CN. I think they bought up the Eastern and Joliet Railway and used it as kind of like a tri-state tollway to bypass taking trains through Chicago. So when you guys talk about Barrington and up by Jerry, that's the answer to bypassing the urban metropolitan area.
Well, it seems to me like it could be done, and that's one of those things that I would like to see, Buttigieg begin to look at with the infrastructure improvements that hopefully might be coming. I want to make sure that we ask you people, is there legislation coming that you know about? Are there things that you think we could help with? Because we do have some reach of getting some publicity out there and legislation and things like that. So please keep in touch with us and let us know if you have some concerns.
Yeah, there's the legislation that I mentioned through Brad Schneider. And then there's always, the making sure that we have more than one engineer in a, engineer in a train. The volatility would be legislation to address the volatility of the crude oil, and getting EPC breaks. Those are all pieces of legislation that have been bumped in and bumped back out, and but I do have a list of legislation on the People Before Profits page also. I'll include that in an email.
Can I ask another question?
Charles, go ahead.
I realize this may be difficult to ascertain, but does anybody know how much traffic, what is the volume of traffic of crude oil through Chicago on a weekly basis? How many carloads?
I think that is difficult to ascertain. I once had that statistic, but it was a lie.
I've never been able to figure it out, so.
They lie about it.
Well, yeah.
They won't tell you.
Somebody knows, but they're not going to tell.
Right.
one thing I've found with that issue, the industry has once again lied and said that it's a security issue because they're worried about terrorists attacking the train. And I forget the name of the New York State politician, but his response to that probably 5 years ago was, well, if you live near the tracks, all you need is a stopwatch and a window to figure out how often the trains are coming by and when. But the reality is the reason why rail companies and oil companies don't want you to know, actually they don't care about you at all. That's tradable, investable information. If you know where oil is moving, what kind of oil, and how often. And Wall Street traders would like to have that information. And so occasionally you'll see the rail companies say it's a competitive industry secret, which is why we won't tell you. And that's again the closest they come to the truth. But it all has to do with money. It has nothing to do. The idea that the rail industry, who's behind oil by rail, in the way it's currently moved, cares about public safety in any way is just laughable. So, but unfortunately, that information is very difficult to come by.
Hello, can I say one thing? This is Paul Berlin. I do know the Southeast Environmental Observatory. They have a website that tracks oil movements. And I did notice, by the way, a 1267 train on near 59 on Gulf Road. So it does go through Barrington, I'm pretty sure. I did, positively see 1267 placard near 59 on Gulf Road. And I also want to say there was a plan to route the trains around Chicago, but there's also a group in Rockford area that is fighting that because it's the not in my backyard principle. And so we have a situation where suburban activists are saying not in my backyard, and so they're not communicating with the Chicago activists. So this is another problem. Because I think, in my opinion, there's a lot more people in Chicago, so I'd rather have it routed around Chicago. And that's my 2 cents on that.
Well, I think unless anybody has any other questions, I think that's a wrap.
Great.
Let me
have a question.
I forgot to make a. I keep hitting the wrong button. I just want to make a plug for the highball. And I'm not as technically, I'm kind of in Bruce's category of with my technological savviness. But if I were more savvy, I'd put up our website, share our website. But railroadworkersunited.org, you can get on our mailing list and get the email version of the highball mailed to you, as well as our updates on a bi-weekly news updates and stuff like that, and a wealth of information. So I just want to make a plug, and thanks again for inviting me and for everybody participating.
Yeah, I want to do the same, to thank you for inviting me to participate in this. Leonard Cohen wrote a song in which he said, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And I think what we can do is, and what we are doing, is to keep shining that light. And I think as well, and I think it was Jerry that said it at one point, there is, the shock of an accident fades over time, and it's certainly was motivating me to write my book, to provide a record to help at least mitigate the tendency to forget. And I want to thank you for not forgetting and for keeping this going.
Thank you, Bruce.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody, for being on. We'll have news about next month. And take care, everybody. Keep in touch. If we can help, let us know.